The sky above the northern coast was often more cloud than light, more wind than calm, and more silence than sound. There, tucked into the jagged teeth of a Scandinavian shoreline, lay a fishing village so small and so quiet, maps barely remembered to name it. Its wooden houses leaned into the earth as if the wind might carry them off, and its people spoke in low tones, as though the sea itself might be listening. In this quiet place, the village and the ocean had an understanding. The people gave respect, the sea gave fish. It was not written, and it was never promised, but for generations, it held. Nets were cast by dawn and drawn by dusk. Fish cod mostly, and herring when they were lucky, were salted, dried, and packed into barrels that would one day roll their way toward southern markets. The villagers lived by the tides, and their dreams smelled faintly of salt. No great war ever came here. No king's banner ever flew. It was a place for those who preferred whispers over speeches and starlight over torches. Yet something strange began in one unassuming spring, when the snow melted quicker than usual, and the gulls flew low and lazy over the water. That spring, a boat didn't return. It wasn't unheard of. Boats got caught in storms, capsized, or drifted off course. The sea was known to take what it wanted. But then a second boat disappeared, and then a third. Each vessel had left with strong men, full barrels, and prayers whispered at the edge of the dock. Each was captained by someone respected, someone who had known the ocean's moods, and each simply vanished. At first, the villagers explained it away. They blamed shifting tides, old wood, or even the reckless confidence of the younger fishermen. But inside their homes, behind thick walls of pine, their thoughts whispered darker possibilities. The village had no church, but it had rituals, soft ones, old ones. The tying of knots in a particular order, the way fish heads were buried near the waterline to appease whatever dwelled beneath. And now, those old practices were performed a little more carefully. Nets were folded in silence. Salt was spread in the shape of circles. Each evening, fog rolled in, heavier and more persistent than the night before. It crept over the cliffs and wrapped around rooftops, muting the world in a dull gray hush. The sound of waves breaking on rocks became slower, more distant, as though the shore itself was inching backward. The children were the first to notice. They spoke of hearing things in the mist-deep creaking sounds like boats without rowers, and long, low whistles that mimicked the wind but never changed direction. Their stories were dismissed with shushes and stern eyes, but parents listened a little closer at night, pressing ears to walls that had never lied before. The village elder, a man named Thorland who had not stepped onto a boat in 20 years, sat at the edge of the dock each dusk. His eyes scanned the horizon as if waiting for something only he could recognize. People stopped asking what he saw. He didn't answer anymore. Soon, small things began to go missing. Oars left leaning against shacks vanished. Fishing knives disappeared from their sheaths. A barrel of salted fish was found with its lid gone and its contents scattered, no footprints, no signs of animals, just fish laid out in a wide spiral that no one admitted to seeing. When a fourth boat didn't return, the village grew quieter. The wind still howled, and the tide still rose and fell, but people spoke less, even to one another. Meals were eaten without chatter. The path to the shore became lonelier with each passing dawn, but still, each morning fishermen went out. Perhaps it was duty, perhaps it was denial. But one by one they kept leaving. Some returned, some did not. The villagers began carving small charms wooden fish strung on hemp cord, or driftwood pendants burned with protective runes. These were left in windows, hung over doorways, or dropped into the sea with closed eyes. It wasn't religion exactly, just old ways from older stories. And in the evenings, as darkness fell like a blanket over the coastline, the fog returned. It pressed against the houses like a thing alive. It slid beneath doors and kissed the backs of necks with wet breath. The smell of fish never faded. But now, it was tainted with something else, something faintly metallic and bitter, like rust on a blade long left in water. One morning, the village awoke to find one of the smaller docks barely more than a crooked row of plank shad snapped and floated off in the night. No storm had passed. The sea had been still. Yet it was gone. Near the broken edge, embedded in the wet sand, lay a single boot. It was made of thick sealskin, expertly stitched. It belonged to no one they could name. No name, no boat, no body. Still, the village did not panic. Panic was a loud thing, and this village did not do loud. Instead, they adjusted. They left out offerings in the morning, smoked fish, polished stones, and bits of bread in wooden bowls. Whether for the sea or for something else, no one asked. No one explained. The pattern continued. The fog grew thicker. The sea grew quieter. The boats grew fewer. The people waited. And the village held its breath. Ivar had been a fisherman for as long as he had been anything. His hands were thick, calloused, and always smelled faintly of rope and salt. He moved slowly, deliberately, and spoke as though each word cost a small coin. But what set Ivar apart wasn't his strength nor his skill, though both were respected. It was his quiet gift for storytelling, meandering tales told around the smoke hole, laced with dry humor and odd details that made children lean forward and forget they were sleepy. He lived alone in a modest timber cottage tucked behind a stand of wind-twisted pines, where the gulls rarely cried and the snow melted a little slower. His wife had passed years earlier, and their only child had sailed south and never returned by choice or by fate, Ivar never said. But he seemed content in his solitude, spending his days repairing nets, carving charms from bone, and listening to the rhythm of the tide as it echoed inside the walls of his chest. It was early in the season, and the air still held the sharpness of winter, though green had begun to edge the hillsides. The sea was unusually calm, its surface glassy and motionless, as though holding a breath. Ivar stood at the end of the main dock, staring out toward the horizon, where the fog clung like old wool. He had not planned to sail that day. His boat, an older craft named Eldfiskra, name half forgotten and never translated, needed a new brace near the keel, and the rope lines had started to fray from salt and age. But something had shifted. The tide was pulling differently. The gulls, always greedy and noisy, had fallen silent. That morning, before light broke over the cliffs, Ivar had awoken to a sound he could not name. It was deep, not loud, but it carried through the floorboards like a hum. Not thunder, not wind, not the grinding of ice. It was as if the sea itself had exhaled beneath his home. He had sat up, blinked into the half-darkness, and whispered something, though even he didn't know what. Outside, the fog moved past his window like slow breath on glass. By the time he reached the dock, his neighbors were already watching. No one called out. A few nodded. One old man crossed himself in the way of forgotten faith. Ivar simply stepped into Eldfisker, checked the oarlocks, and pushed off with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. The boat glided silently out into the bay. No creak, no splash, just the soft parting of water and the distant cry of something that might have been a bird or might not have been. As he rode past the cliffs that marked the outer edge of the village's known fishing grounds, Ivar paused. He looked back not at the village, but at the narrow strip of rock where a small stone altar stood, weather-worn and half-sunk into sea moss. It had once been a place of offerings, long before memory made it a landmark instead of a shrine. But today, he dipped his hand into the sea and flung 3 droplets toward it. Old habits. The fog thickened as he moved beyond the shelf of familiar waters. The currents changed subtly here, less predictable, more prone to sudden shifts. It was where the older fishers used to speak of the deep lines, places where the sea grew strangely dark and cold, even in summer. Few went this far now, except the desperate or the curious. Ivar was both. He didn't know what he hoped to find. A new line of cod, a clue to the vanished boats, a feeling that something had returned to him. Maybe all of it, maybe nothing. Hours passed. He dropped his lines, waited, pulled them up. Empty. Once he thought he saw a figure standing on the water, a trick of mist and light. Just for a moment. A pale shape, unmoving. Then it was gone. Later, as he repositioned, a small fish with silver eyes and no mouth wriggled in his net. It was no species he knew. He returned it to the sea. He cast again. The sky never truly brightened. The sun was only a suggestion behind the fog. Time passed like a drifting current, soft, slow, unnoticed. Then came the whisper. It wasn't a voice, more like a vibration through the hull, a gentle pressure against the soles of his feet, rising through the boat like a sigh. It didn't frighten him, not yet. but it made him pause. He set his oars inside the boat and leaned over the side, peering into the water. There was no reflection, only blackness, deep and velvety like ink spilled across the world. He dipped his hand in. The water was warm. He frowned, wiped it on his tunic, and sat back. And then he saw the marks along the inner hull of his boat. Shallow carvings he had not made. Circles, spirals, loops, old symbols. Some he half recognized from the bone charms of his childhood. Others he had never seen. He touched one, and the fog moved. It rolled suddenly, collapsing in on itself like breath sucked inward. The world turned white. He felt the boat shift, not rock, not tilt, just shift, as though it were no longer floating but being carried. Then everything fell still again. He was no longer certain how far from shore he was. The coastline had vanished. The air was thick with the smell of brine and something sweet, like fermented berries. And far beneath him, something moved, not quickly, not violently, just enough to ripple the water without sound. Ivar sat very still. He had seen many things in his life, storms that split the sky in half, whales the size of houses, fish with eyes like glass. But this felt different. It felt observed. He didn't return that night, or the next, nor the next after that. The villagers waited. His dock sat empty. His cottage remained untouched. The net he'd left drying still hung limp on its pole, swaying in the stillness like a forgotten prayer. And in the mornings, when the fog rolled back just enough to glimpse the waterline, some swore they saw his boat. Not adrift, not broken, just sitting there, far out, still and silent, watching. Before words were carved into stone or inked into sagas, the sea had its own language. The fishermen of the northern coast did not speak of it much, and when they did, it was never directly. It was a language of gestures, signs, and rituals passed from one calloused hand to another. And though no one admitted it, every boatman followed its grammar like instinct. They called it the codes, though no one could recite them in full. You learned them slowly by watching elders pause before stepping aboard, by noticing when a net was folded clockwise instead of counter, by hearing how a chant under the breath replaced a greeting when fog crept too close. New fishermen learned not by teaching, but by repetition. A father might nod toward a rust-colored stone shaped like a herring's tail and say, "Don't fish past there after dusk." No explanation. The lesson came later, maybe, in the stillness between catches or in the story of a cousin who once ignored the rule and never came home. One of the oldest codes was the ritual of bone charms, small, simple tokens carved from fish spine or bird talon. Each bore a specific marking, some meant for luck, others for safety, and a few never to be touched unless the sea itself asked for it, whatever that meant. These were tied to nets, tucked into satchels, or buried under seats. If you looked closely, you'd see them hanging from nearly every mast, swaying gently with the rhythm of the boat, like quiet reminders. There were others. No whistling on the water. Never name your boat after someone still living. If a seal follows your boat for more than a mile, turn back. If your line pulls but the sea is flat, let it go. And then there were the unspoken ones. Rules that didn't seem tied to logic or safety, but to memory. Boats weren't launched on the 7th day of any month ending in R. No net should be cast within sight of the altar rock after the spring equinox. And if you found driftwood carved with spirals, you returned it to the water, no matter how good the timber looked. Most dismissed them as superstition, a relic of older times. Yet nearly all obeyed themes, especially in seasons like the one now falling upon the village, when the boats didn't return, and the fog clung like a second skin. In those days, the codes came back with force. The few fishermen still willing to row out began tying their charms more tightly, humming low, tuneless songs as they cast their lines. They avoided certain places without admitting why. Some carved new symbols onto the hulls of their boats, using tools borrowed from the blacksmith's wife, who refused to ask questions anymore. Even the village children began to notice the shift. Games that once involved leaping from dock pylons or hiding behind barrels gave way to quieter pastimes. They sat near the shore and made tiny offerings from reeds and shells, floating them in the tide with murmured hopes. One girl, no more than 6, began painting symbols in soot on the rocks, copying shapes she claimed to have seen in her dreams. When asked, she said simply, "They're the signs the sea likes." Meanwhile, inside the longhouse, an old structure half buried in earth and covered in wind-smoothed moss, the remaining elders met without fire. They sat in the cold and spoke in low tones, voices muffled by the thick furs wrapped around their shoulders. They remembered stories of a winter-long past when a similar fog had come, thick enough to drown a shout, of men who followed whispers into the deep water and came back wrong eyes too pale, memories missing, nets full of fish no one could name. They spoke of the deep-lined ones, a name that had not been uttered in years, not people, not beasts, something older, something that lived in the places maps forgot to draw, where the sea grew heavy and warm and compasses spun in circles. One elder, a hunched woman named Sini, spoke of her mother's sister, who had disappeared when she was a child. She'd been a net weaver, known for her peculiar habit of tying extra knots into each line. One spring, she'd gone to the water alone, saying she heard the bones calling. She was never seen again, but her net washed back ashore 2 weeks later, coiled perfectly like a serpent, with all its knots untied. Now the villagers looked to these old codes not as folklore, but as protection. Fishermen who remained affixed extra bone charms to their belts. They mixed powdered amber into their food. One family smeared seaweed ash across their doorframe, whispering a line in Old Norse that no one could fully translate anymore. And through it all, the sea remained oddly still. No waves, no storms, just the constant presence of fog, the occasional groan of shifting ice far off the coast, and the eerie quietness of a water that seemed to listen more than it moved. One man, a widower named Fenric, returned from a brief expedition with a single fisher creature long and colorless, with no eyes and translucent fins. He said little as he docked, but when pressed, he only said, "The waters." Watching. He never went out again. That night, a charm made from braided kelp and fishbone was found hanging from every home. No one claimed to have made them. The codes had returned not as tradition, but as necessity. And still, Ivar's boat remained unseen. Ivar's absence grew longer than anyone expected. 3 days turned to 6, then 9. By the 10th, his boat was spoken of only in hushed tones, if at all. No one dared to say the word lost. In that village, the sea did not take people, it kept them. But on the 11th day, just before the faint blush of dawn touched the water, something changed. Beneath a sky the color of slate, the sea stirred for the first time in weeks. Not violently, just a quiet, steady rolling, like something beneath had shifted its weight. And with it came the wind. Not cold, but oddly warm and sweet, like early summer carried on the breath of something ancient. The villagers woke to find the fog thinning, curling away from the shore like a reluctant veil. And as it lifted just for a moment, a silhouette appeared far out at sea low, narrow, unmistakable. A boat, but not Ivar's. This one was longer, lower, and covered in strange symbols. Its sail half torn and stained with what looked like dried lichen was furled. The boat glided silently toward the bay, moved by no visible oars or tide. Those who saw it didn't call out. They didn't run. They just watched as it passed the outer rocks and slid into the deeper inlet, before coming to a perfect stop near the old jetty. It rocked gently, making no sound, the way an empty cradle might. There was no one aboard, no nets, no tools, not even a bench for sitting. Only a small bundle, wrapped in black cloth and tied with twisted reed cord, resting where the helm should have been. The village priesta man, too young to remember the old codes, and too cautious to openly defy them, was the first to approach. He stepped lightly, murmuring a prayer beneath his breath, though his voice trembled with each word. He untied the bundle and carefully unwrapped it. Inside lay a single, hollowed fish skull larger than a man's head, its jaws lined with rows of tiny, bone-fine teeth. It shimmered faintly in the dim light, as though dusted with frost or stars. No one could name the species. No one tried. The priest dropped the bundle and stepped back, his face pale. Behind him, others crossed themselves in silence. A child began to cry, though softly, as if sensing they were in a place where even loud fear was forbidden. The boat remained untouched for 2 full days. On the 3rd, it was gone. Not drifted, not stolen, just gone as if it had never been. But that skull, if that's what it truly was, remained. The priest had tried to take it inside the church, but the moment it crossed the threshold, every candle went out. He left it near the altar stone at the water's edge, wrapped again in cloth. Within hours, a tide higher than any in memory surged through the bay and pulled it away. Some say the sea accepted it. Others say it was never meant to be left behind. That same night, old Sini spoke again. She had not left her cottage in over a year, but now she hobbled to the meeting hall with her wooden staff and her shawl of woven feathers, claiming to know what was coming. Her voice was sharp, dry, and trembled only when she mentioned the name of the fisherman who vanished before Ivar. She told of another vanishing one long ago, from a time when the village had not yet built docks, and boats were still dragged over stone. A crew of 7 had sailed in search of deeper waters after a season of meager catches. They had carved strange figures into their hull for luck, symbols whispered to them by a foreign peddler who claimed to speak with sea spirits. None returned. But the next spring, someone found a bundle of fish bones braided into rope, hung high in a tree, far from shore. And etched into a nearby rock was a spiral that turned inward until it vanished. The elders of that time had built a cairn and buried what they could, naming no names and speaking no blame. Let the sea hold its own, they had said. We are not its masters. Sini warned that the codes were not merely for caution, but for balance. The sea, she said, has rhythms, like breath. If we ignore them, we speak out of turn. And the sea listens. Others scoffed. One younger fisherman, Rurik, bold and always half-drunk, claimed these stories were used to keep men from seeking new waters. That fear was the real fog. He said this loud enough for others to hear, and louder still when he left the next morning with his son to fish where Ivar had last been seen. They never came back. Their boat was found 3 days later, half buried in silt along the river mouth, 50 miles inland, an impossible location given the tides and the season. Inside were no bodies. Only their clothes, neatly folded, and a pile of fish no one had ever seen before silver, with no scales, and eyes that looked like polished opals. No one ate them. Not long after, something curious began to happen in the village. Dreams. People began waking with fragments of places they'd never been, endless shorelines of black glass, skies with 2 suns, soft voices speaking in a language that felt familiar but couldn't be understood. Children murmured words in their sleep, words not taught by anyone in living memory. One boy claimed he met Ivar in a dream. He was smiling, the boy said, but his eyes weren't his anymore. They were filled with the sea. And so the elders turned once more to the codes-burning kelp ash, hanging netting over windows, leaving offerings of smoked fish near the shore. The stories, once bedtime tales or warnings half forgotten, became ritual again. Not because they believed in them, because they remembered them. They didn't speak of Ivar anymore. They remembered him, like the others. The sea, now more than ever, felt like it was watching. Mornings came with less light. The sun, when it broke through the mist, looked older, duller, as though it too had grown wary of casting its gaze on that stretch of water. Even birds flew wider arcs around the coast, and seals, once regular companions to the fishermen, stopped appearing altogether. The village grew quieter. Fewer boats went out. Conversations, once filled with laughter and the rough confidence of coastal life, softened into whispers and lingering glances. The market, once a bustle of trade and gossip, thinned to a murmur. Fresh fish became rare. But amidst the hush, something stirred, something older than superstition and more persistent than fog. It began with a sound. Just after midnight, when most had curled beneath wool and fur, a long, slow hum drifted from the bay. Not quite a melody, not quite wind. A low resonance that vibrated in the bones more than the ears. Dogs whimpered, infants stirred. The elderly woke, suddenly alert, as though remembering something they had tried hard to forget. That hum came again the next night, and the next. Each time it grew a little louder. Not harsh, not angry, but present, like the voice of someone speaking from behind a wall of water. On the 5th night, something even stranger happened. A net long unused, hung high in the rafters of the boathouse, fell without cause. Its ropes tangled into shapes that some claimed resembled letters or runes, though none could say what they meant. Old Sini said nothing, She simply turned and left, muttering, "It's begun again." The next morning, the villagers found the altar stone down by the shore, an ancient monolith left by forgotten hands marked with fresh cuts. Not scratches from wind or animal, but deliberate carvings. Spirals, waves, eyes. A council was called in the longhouse. Not of priests or chieftains, they had none any more but of the eldest and the quietest, those who still remembered things others wished they didn't. It was there, in the flickering candlelight and the slow creak of old timber, that they spoke once more of the Rift Path. A name almost no one under 40 had heard before. The Rift Path was not a road or a trail. It was a channel, long since collapsed, or so it was thought. A deep groove in the seafloor that older generations claimed led beneath. Beneath what, no one ever made clear. It was said to appear only under certain tides, marked by the appearance of twin spiraling currents and a change in the color of the water when blue turned to deep green and then to ink. The last time it had opened was 3 generations ago, and each time it did, someone disappeared. Not kidnapped, not drowned, called. In all those stories, the same phrase returned. They followed the deep line, a line not drawn on any map, not traced by any compass, but etched into the sea's memory like a fold in fabric. This time, the sea wasn't calling just one. That night, 7 villagers packed quietly. They took few supplies. No nets, no hooks, only salt, bread, and bundles wrapped in sealskin. They made no announcement. They left at dusk, walking side by side toward the smallest dock at the edge of the inlet. Among them was Sini. She moved slowly, leaning heavily on her carved staff, her eyes clouded but steady. When asked why she was going, she simply said, "Because I remember what happens when no one does." The 7 pushed off in silence. No songs, no rituals, only the long, quiet creak of the boat vanishing into the gray. The next morning, the entire bay was empty. No birds, no fish, not even the hum of wind across the waves. Only stillness. And then the dreams returned. They became stronger, shared. People awoke with identical memories of standing on a black beach that pulsed like a heartbeat, beneath stars that moved in slow spirals, of hearing names they had never spoken before, of seeing boats pass overhead, not on water, but through clouds the color of stone. Children began humming the same tune in their sleep, one that matched the nightly hum from the sea. And on the 7th day, the sea changed. It turned dark. Not with storm, not with rain, but with density, as though something massive stirred beneath the waves, shifting unseen. Water clung to the shore like oil, heavy and still. That morning, a small bundle washed ashore. Inside a single braid of white hair wrapped in fish skin tied with a black ribbon. It belonged to Sini. No one wept. No one screamed. They merely placed it beneath the altar stone and returned to their homes. After that, boats were no longer repaired. No new nets were tied. The village did not say it was ending. It simply grew still. The sea had asked, and the village finally remembered how to answer. The stillness settled like snow. Days passed without wind, without gulls, without tide. The sea remained, of course. It was always there, but it had changed. No longer a moving, restless thing. It had become something else entirely. A mirror, maybe, or a mouth held just slightly open. Fishermen stopped going out altogether. Even the boldest, those who had once challenged fog, storms, and rumor, began to leave their boats overturned on the shore, unused. The village itself took on a different rhythm. Less work, fewer sounds. People moved more slowly, spoke only when needed. There was no fear, not exactly, just listening. The old paths to the water grew over with dune grass. A heron stood motionless on the far end of the inlet for 3 days without leaving. Then it, too, was gone. In this hush, something returned. One evening, as the sky bruised itself into dusk, a light flickered out at sea. Not a lantern, not fire. Something softer, almost like starlight trapped in a jar. It hovered low over the water, pulsing slowly, drawing no wind or ripple. A dozen villagers stood along the ridge and watched it without speaking. They didn't point. They didn't ask questions, because they all felt the same thing. The pull. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something much deeper, like the memory of a lullaby heard in the womb, or the echo of a name no one had ever called them by, yet felt right. That night, a boy named Tormund disappeared. He was 12, always quiet, always wandering near the tide pools. His parents found only his boots neatly set side by side on the shore, facing the open water. In the days that followed, others followed him, one by one. An old man named Ove, who hadn't spoken in years. A young couple who had lost a child 2 winters prior. The widow of the harbor keeper. No notes, no screams, no boats, just absence. And always the faint hum remained in the background, soft and steady, like the thrum of blood in the ear. People began calling it the second breath, not something they understood, but something they felt, as if the sea had begun breathing again, and the rhythm of its breath was not measured in hours or tides, but in choices. The village priest, now gaunt and pale from restless sleep, attempted to record the disappearances. He mapped the locations, sketched the patterns in the dirt, marked the phases of the moon. But every morning his papers were blank. Ink vanished, parchment curled. One morning the pages were all soaked, though no rain had fallen. He stopped trying. Instead, he walked down to the shore each day and sat beside the altar stone, watching the water, sometimes whispering, sometimes just sitting. One morning he didn't return. His robe was found folded neatly beside the tide pools. The only trace of him was a line of footprints that ended abruptly in the sand. The footprints faced inward toward the village, not the sea. By now the place had changed completely. Children no longer ran. The market stalls stood empty. Tools lay where they had last been used. The bell in the chapel tower, once rung daily at noon, had not sounded in weeks. And then one evening, the fog came back. Not slowly, as it had arrived the first time, but all at once, as though it had never left, only paused. It rolled in fast and thick, swallowing houses and hearths and paths in seconds. Lamps were snuffed without wind. The hum grew louder, not harsh but insistent, as if the sea had decided to speak in full. It didn't say words. It simply filled every space. And in that saturation, people began to remember things they had not lived. Dreams that weren't theirs. Languages they'd never learned. A name that didn't belong to anyone living, but that everyone suddenly knew Askra. No one knew what Askra was. A place, perhaps, or a being, or a memory. But once the name arrived, it settled deep, like roots curling around the spine. Children began whispering it in their sleep. A man wrote it in the ash on his hearthstone, even though he couldn't recall doing it. That night, another bundle washed ashore. This time, it held a carved wooden fish, painted with strange colors that shimmered faintly in the dark. Around its neck was a string of shells, smooth, small, and arranged in a spiral. The spiral again. The villagers placed it with the other unspoken tokens of a story unfolding beneath their feet. They began building a circle of these bundles near the altar stone. A quiet shrine, a memory garden. No one spoke of it aloud, but each morning the circle was just a little larger, and every time someone vanished, a new object would appear inside it, never with sound or witness, just there, like a message half-whispered in sleep. By now, only a few dozen remained. Those who had stayed did not wait for explanation. They simply lived in the hush, keeping small fires, tending to birds that lingered and sometimes standing still in the fog, listening for names they hadn't heard yet. No one questioned why they stayed. Perhaps they too were waiting for the sea to call their name. The fog did not lift. Days, then weeks, passed in a gentle dimness. The sun, when it broke through the cloud bank, appeared thin and silver, not casting real light but suggesting its presence. The villagers stopped keeping track of time by sky or calendar. The rhythm of life moved according to something else, tides unseen, memories uncertain. The sea remained still but never silent. Its hum, now fully part of the village's soundtrack, had shifted tone lower, more resonant, as though whatever once lay beneath had risen closer to the surface. You couldn't feel it in your ears anymore. You felt it in your ribs. Those who remained became different. Not strange, not wild, only quieter. They moved slowly, with purpose. They looked at each other longer. Their eyes, once bright or weary or youthful, took on the same distant softness, like they were always looking at something just behind you. Then came the night of the green tide. It began at dusk when the water lapping the stones shimmered with a faint emerald hue. Not algae, not reflected light, something deeper, something self-lit. The water pulsed like breath, like lungs full of song. That night, the altar stone glowed faintly for the first time in living memory. The circle of bundles, now a full ring, caught the light like stained glass. The spiral of shells at its center had grown larger, though no one added to it. The objects kept appearing on their own, fragments of wood shaped like oars, bits of woven netting that smelled faintly of myrrh, carved bone charms in the shapes of eyes and teeth. But the strangest object came on the third night of the green tide. It was a helmet, small, clearly ceremonial, and covered in runes that shimmered blue when the fog touched them. No one had ever seen that design before, not Viking, not Saxon, not any known tribe. Inside it was a piece of leather etched with a single word, Askra, the same word that had haunted dreams and drifted on sea breezes for weeks. It was then that they understood. Askra was not a person, or a place, or a ship. Askra was a memory, a collective one. The sea had begun remembering something too ancient for language, and it was using the villagers, what remained of them, as vessels. Not in a malicious way, not as puppets, but as containers for stories too heavy for water alone. Each disappearance, then, was not a death. It was a retrieval, a reclaiming of something lost, and slowly the village realized they were part of a memory older than their own bones, older than their land, older than the sea as they knew it. This understanding didn't come with fear. It came with stillness. That night, the priest's old balloonized, unpulled rang once. No one touched it. It simply rang, once, low and resonant. Then it split, a hairline crack down the middle, and fell silent forever. The next morning, the last child disappeared. Her name was Elka. She had long black hair and had not spoken since her parents vanished weeks before. She had been drawing spirals in the dust, in the ash, on every surface she could reach. They found her shoes set beside the shrine and a small figure carved of driftwood inside the circle. It had her eyes. People stopped searching after that, because searching no longer meant seeking. It meant remembering. The sea gave one final gift before changing course again. On the seventh night of the green tide, the villagers awoke to find the shoreline scattered with stones, perfectly round, perfectly smooth, as if shaped by centuries of movement, though they were dry and warm to the touch. Each villager picked up one, and each saw something different reflected in its surface. A loved one, a distant shore, a night sky with stars that no longer existed. These stones were not tools or clues or weapons. They were pieces of story, carried across centuries, across tides, through forgotten tongues and hushed prayers. The villagers placed the stones into the circle, at the very center, where the spiral ended, and when the last stone touched the earth, the green tide receded, so slowly. The fog stayed, but the sea's hum softened, no longer calling, no longer reaching, just breathing, as if it had finally told the story it needed to tell. And the village, what remained of it, settled into a rhythm not of survival, but of remembering. They no longer called roll, no longer asked where anyone had gone, because the sea was not empty, it was full of memory, and it remembered them all. By now, the village was little more than a whisper. Houses stood in perfect quiet, weathered but intact, as though waiting for occupants who had merely stepped out for a moment. Smoke no longer rose from the chimneys. Footpaths were overgrown with moss, yet strangely undisturbed, no signs of panic, no clutter, no abandoned tools. Only the trace of footsteps where people had walked away slowly, purposefully. At the edge of the water, the shrine remained. The spiral of shells had become the center of all things. Each morning it was just slightly different new pieces added without a sound, bits of whalebone smoothed by current, feathers from seabirds no one had seen in weeks, small stones painted with symbols no one recognized. No one questioned how the shrine changed. They simply accepted it, tended to it, smoothed the sand around it, whispered to it. And yet something new emerged during that quiet era. Not a threat, not a visitor, but a memory in motion. A boy named Einar, barely 15, lean and pale from the hunger that had crept in without fish, woke one night from a dream so vivid he could still feel the salt on his lips. In it, he had walked into the water, not sinking but descending, as if stepping through layers of sky. Below him, cities of coral shaped like runestones, fish with human eyes, and great whales that sang in voices he understood. The next day, Einar began building something. Not a boat. Not quite. It was longer, sleeker shaped not for the surface but for slipping into narrow spaces. He worked without drawings, without guidance, simply knowing where each piece belonged. When asked, he said the wood had been left for him, and when asked by whom, he answered, the remembering. Others joined him. Not with hammers, but with silence. They placed objects in the boats, hollow bones wrapped in kelp, strands of braided hair, small woven dolls made from dune grass. It wasn't until the vessel was finished that they realized it had no sail, no oars, no way to steer. It wasn't meant to be used. It was meant to arrive. That night, they slid it into the water. The tide took it gently, as though it had been waiting. And in the distance, barely visible through the fog, the water shimmered in a long, dark line stretching straight out to sea. The rift path. It had returned. No whirlpools, no monstrous tides, just a still, narrow groove in the ocean's surface, darker than the rest, like a shadow where none should be. The villagers stood along the ridge and watched the vessel slip along that line without resistance, gliding toward the mist. Then it vanished. Not with speed, with certainty. In the weeks that followed, more villagers disappeared. But now there was no sadness, only quiet farewells. A loaf of bread left on a doorstep, a bundle of herbs on a windowsill, a last look at the sea before walking into the fog barefoot. Among those who left was Einar. He left no note, no sound, only a single painted stone at the shrine's center, bearing the symbol of an eye above a wave. Those who remained began to forget what day it was. Then what year? Not because their minds failed, but because the sea had begun to erase everything but the story. They remembered the vanished, but not the village's name. They remembered the dreams, but not their own birthdays. They remembered the hum, the shrine, and Askra. Always Askra. Askra became the lullaby of the land. Sometimes the word would appear carved into tree bark or scratched faintly on the side of a pot. Children would say it without knowing what it meant. The sea would whisper it in foam. Then came the final transformation, not cataclysmic, just inevitable. A light rain fell for 3 days, soft and steady. When it stopped, every roof was covered in a fine moss. The stones of the shore had turned black not with soot, but with some mineral pulled from the depths. The fog no longer hung low. It spiraled upward, curling into the sky like smoke, and the altar stone cracked cleanly, evenly from corner to corner. Inside the crack, something shimmered, not gold, not fire, something older than either. A flicker of memory made visible. And as the remaining villagers watched, the spiral of shells lifted not into the air, but into itself. The shells spun, folding downward like water draining through sand. They vanished with no sound. The shrine was gone. No one spoke for 3 days. And then, as if a tide had pulled back, a new rhythm began. The sea began moving again. Birds returned. The fish came back. But no one fished. Not because they were afraid, because they knew the sea had finished telling its story. And stories, when fully told, do not repeat. They echo. And echoes belong to the water. The returning sea was softer now. No longer restless or demanding, it swelled gently like a lullaby breathed into the skin. The fishermen who remained had changed too. Their hands, once calloused from nets and lines, were now smooth, as if washed clean by an unseen tide. Their eyes held quiet understanding, like they had seen the ocean's secrets and returned with only whispers. The village, still cloaked in mist and memory, began to heal in silence. No longer a place of loss, but of transformation. One morning, a stranger appeared on the shore. Not a man, not quite. She was tall and slender, with hair that shimmered like the surface of water at dawn, and eyes the color of deep fjords. Her voice was soft, almost a hum, and when she spoke, the air seemed to ripple like a stone skipping across a pond. She carried a basket woven from seaweed and driftwood, filled with small, round shells that clicked quietly as she moved. The villagers did not fear her. They welcomed her. She called herself Myra, and she said she came from Askra, a place between places, between land and sea, between waking and dreaming. Mera spoke of stories long forgotten of a tribe that had lived beneath the waves, of people who could breathe water as easily as air, and of a time when land and sea had been one. She told them that the disappearances were not vanishings at all, but journeys, that the sea had been calling the fishermen home to Askra, where their stories would live forever. The villagers listened, and slowly they understood. Myra taught them to listen to the water in a new way, not as a force to be conquered or feared, but as a storyteller patient, ancient, and ever-changing. She showed them how to find music in the hum, how to read the shifting tides as pages of a book. And in return, the villagers shared their memories of storms weathered, of meals shared under starry skies, of silent mornings on boats heavy with fish. Myra wove these stories into songs, singing softly as she worked. Her voice was the sound of waves breaking on smooth stones, of wind through pine needles, of rain tapping gently on wooden roofs. The villagers began to gather each evening by the shore, drawn by the music that seemed to rise from the sea itself. They sang with Myra, their voices blending with the ocean's hum, creating a harmony that felt older than time. In this new rhythm, the village found peace. No longer waiting for disappearances or fearing the unknown, they embraced the mystery. They understood that life, like the sea, was a cycle of coming and going, of stories told and retold. And as the seasons turned, the village transformed. The houses grew green with moss and vines, the paths bloomed with wildflowers, and the air was filled with the gentle sounds of water and song. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Myra stood at the water's edge. She smiled softly and said, "Askra is not just a place. It is a memory carried in the heart, a story that lives in the silence between waves." And with that, she stepped into the sea. Her form shimmered and faded, becoming one with the water and light. The villagers watched in quiet wonder. They knew she had returned to where she belonged, but her song remained, a soft, endless lullaby sung by the sea. With Myra's departure, the village felt both lighter and fuller, as if a breath long held was finally released. Yet the air carried the weight of something sacred. The sea, now calm and bright, mirrored the soft gold of the dawn instead of the heavy gray fog of before. The villagers began to notice subtle changes, shells that hummed faint melodies, stones that shimmered with inner light, and trees whose roots curled towards the shore, as if reaching for the tide's secrets. Life took on a quiet ritual. Each morning, fishermen would set out, not with nets, but with hands open, gathering stories whispered on the wind and waves. They spoke little, their faces serene, eyes reflecting distant horizons and memories untold. When they returned, they shared their finds, not fish or shellfish, but fragments of old songs, worn tokens, and soft echoes of vanished voices. One day, an elderly woman named Sigrid discovered a curious object beneath a driftwood pile, a small wooden box, intricately carved with swirling waves and symbols resembling stars. Inside lay a collection of delicate, feather-light scrolls, inscribed in runes unlike any seen before. The ink shimmered faintly, shifting colors like sunlight on water. The villagers gathered, puzzled but entranced. Sigrid carefully unrolled the first scroll, and a hush fell. The runes told a tale of a hidden tribe, those who had once lived beneath the waves, guardians of ancient wisdom, keepers of stories that could shape the course of time. This tribe, known as the Ljósfolk, had vanished from history, remembered only in half-forgotten legends. But these scrolls told a different story, that the Ljósfolk had not disappeared but transformed, becoming part of the sea itself. Their voices carried on every wave and ripple. The villagers realized that their own ancestors might have shared blood or spirit with the Ljósfolk, and that the sea's calling had been a chance to reconnect with a deeper heritage. The discovery ignited a new sense of purpose. The village became a living archive, a sanctuary for memories and stories that could no longer be captured by ordinary means. Every whispered legend, every fading dream, found a place in the heart of the community. Strangely, this deep connection did not tether them to the past. Instead, it freed them. They began to paint murals on the wooden walls of their home scenes of underwater cities, glowing with ethereal light, of fish with eyes that held galaxies, of people walking between waves and stars. These images shifted with the seasons, as if alive, breathing the stories they told. And when night fell, the village gathered once more by the shore. The waves, now gently illuminated by bioluminescent plankton, glowed soft blue-green, casting a calming light over the sand. The villagers sang the songs Myra had taught them, their voices mingling with the ocean's endless hum. In those moments, they were not separate from the sea. They were part of its endless story, a story that stretched beyond time, beyond memory, beyond disappearance. A story that whispered, softly and forever, remember. Time passed like a slow tide, shaping the village's rhythm with quiet persistence. The sea's whispers deepened, weaving new layers of mystery into everyday life. The villagers grew attuned to subtle signs, the way the fog curled like a finger around the cliffs, the shimmer of light on a shell, or the soft murmur beneath the waves that sounded like a lullaby half remembered. In this silence, a new visitor arrived, not by boat or foot, but through the dreams of the eldest fisherman, Olaf. Each night, Olaf found himself drifting beneath the sea, guided by glowing fish that spoke in riddles and currents that twisted like rivers of light. He followed them to a place where water met sky in endless twilight, where figures made of coral and mist danced with shadows that whispered secrets. When Olaf awoke, his eyes held a distant glow, and in his hand was a single feather not from any bird he knew, but shimmering with a faint otherworldly light. He showed the feather to the village, and they gathered to listen as he recounted his dream journey. The villagers believed Olaf had touched the edge of Askra, the hidden realm between worlds that Myra had spoken of. Inspired by his tale, the community began a new tradition, storytelling by the sea at dusk. Each evening, someone would share a story of dreams, memories, or quiet moments passed in nature's embrace. These tales wove together the threads of past and present, blending history with mystery, fact with feeling. The stories became a balm, soothing restless minds and inviting listeners into a gentle trance. Among these tales was one about the sea's own heartbeat, a pulse felt not in waves or tides, but in moments of stillness when the world seemed to hold its breath. It was said that in these moments, the sea spoke directly to those who listened, sharing truths beyond words. One evening, as the village gathered, a child named Freya noticed a strange glow beneath the water's surface. Curious, she waded in, and the water around her shimmered, revealing images of ships sailing across starry skies and forests growing under moonlit waters. Freya's discovery became a silent message. The sea's stories were endless, always changing, always inviting exploration. The villagers embraced this openness. They understood that some mysteries were not meant to be solved, but experienced like a song that unfolds differently with each hearing. And so, the village lived in a gentle balance between knowing and wondering, between memory and dream. The sea was no longer just a boundary or a threat. It was a bridge, a place where stories like currents flowed endlessly, carrying the quiet history of fishermen, dreamers, and lost worlds. And as night fell, the hum of the ocean rose once more, a soft, soothing sound that wrapped around the village like a warm blanket. The seasons turned with a gentle rhythm, the village settling into a life that seemed touched by both time and timelessness. The once restless sea now hummed quietly, almost as if it too had learned to rest. The villagers found themselves drawn not to the water's edge alone, but deeper into the land where ancient trees stood as silent sentinels of forgotten stories. Among these trees was a particular grove, where moss blanketed every branch and soft light filtered through the leaves like a gentle dream. The villagers believed this place was a meeting point, a threshold between the world they knew and the mysteries beyond. It was in this grove that a curious event took place. One morning, the village awoke to find the ground scattered with tiny, glistening seeds. They were unlike any seeds seen before, translucent, with delicate veins that pulsed faintly in the early light. No one knew where they had come from. Slowly, the villagers gathered the seeds and planted them in the fertile soil near the shore. Days passed, and the seeds sprouted not into ordinary plants, but into slender stalks that shimmered softly with colors shifting like the northern lights. The stalks swayed gently even when the air was still, as though listening to some invisible music. The villagers called these plants whisper willows. They believed the willows held the voices of those who had disappeared, echoes of fishermen who had become part of the sea's story. Children often sat beneath their swaying branches, feeling the faint hum in the air, imagining the whispered tales carried by the leaves. One evening, as twilight deepened and stars began to blink awake, the village elder, Ingrid, gathered everyone beneath the whisper willows. She told a story unlike any other of a hidden cave beneath the cliffs, where light and shadow danced together, a place where the veil between land and sea thinned like morning mist. According to legend, this cave was the gateway to Askra. Ingrid's voice was soft and steady, weaving images of underwater forests glowing with bioluminescence, of ancient songs carried on currents, and of souls who had journeyed beyond but left their stories behind. The villagers listened, their eyes heavy but minds alert, carried away on Ingrid's gentle words. That night, the sea seemed to lean closer, its hum deepening into a soothing song. Some claimed they saw faint lights flickering beneath the waves, like lanterns guiding travelers home. Others dreamed of shimmering paths in the water, inviting them to follow. Though none dared to leave again, the sense of connection was profound. The village was no longer just a place of quiet loss. It was a sanctuary where memory and mystery mingled, where the past was a soft song drifting through the whisper willows and the sea. And as sleep settled over the village like a cool, gentle tide, the quiet history of the fishermen lived on, woven into the very fabric of earth, water, and air. Winter came softly, cloaking the village in a blanket of silver frost and quiet snow. The sea, still and glassy, reflected the pale light of short days and long nights. Within this tranquil hush, the village seemed paused, neither moving forward nor slipping backward, held gently in a moment between breaths. During this stillness, a remarkable discovery was made beneath the frozen shore. A fisherman named Leif had wandered near the ice's edge, drawn by a faint glow beneath the surface. Breaking through the thin ice, he found an object lodged in the sand, a small, carved box made of driftwood and encrusted with barnacles. Inside the box lay an old, weathered journal, its pages fragile but preserved, written in the delicate runes the villagers had come to recognize. The journal belonged to a fisherman from generations before the disappearances, detailing daily life, secrets of the sea, and hints of a hidden path to Askra. Leif shared the journal with the village, and as the pages were read aloud by the fireside, a new dimension of their history unfolded. The journal told of rituals performed under the light of full moon, ceremonies that honored the sea's unseen guardians and asked for safe passage in the unknown. It spoke of strange creatures glimpsed beneath waves and of a shimmering gateway that appeared only once every few decades, inviting the chosen few to cross into the other world. One peculiar entry described a rare fish, glowing faintly in the dark, said to be a messenger between worlds. The fisherman claimed it would appear near the shore just before dawn, singing a melody that only the heart could hear. The villagers began watching for this fish, their eyes scanning the quiet water at first light. Some swore they saw flickers of light dancing beneath the surface, and faint musical ripples spreading across the waves. This new mystery rekindled a gentle excitement in the village. No longer just keepers of memory, they were becoming seekers of the sea's hidden songs. In the evenings, storytelling grew richer and more vivid, weaving together the old journal's tales with new dreams and visions. The village became a living tapestry of whispered history, where every word, every song, every quiet breath was part of the endless story. And still, the sea sang its soft lullaby, timeless and patient, wrapping the village in its gentle embrace, as if inviting all who listened to drift slowly into dream and sleep. Spring arrived with a delicate promise, awakening the village from its winter stillness. Soft green shoots pushed through the thawing earth, and the air filled with the faint scent of salt and wildflowers. The sea, no longer frozen, shimmered under gentle breezes that carried whispers from faraway places. The villagers felt a renewed sense of connection to the land, the water, and the stories that bound them. One morning, a young woman named Era ventured farther along the coast than anyone had dared in years. Her curiosity was quiet but persistent, like the slow unfolding of dawn. As she walked, she noticed unusual markings etched into the rock spirals and symbols that seemed to pulse with an ancient energy. Following the patterns, Era discovered a hidden cove, its entrance veiled by hanging moss and twisted branches. Inside, the water glowed softly, illuminated by an unseen light that shifted in rhythm with the tides. At the center of the cove rested a large, smooth stone carved with images of fishermen and sea creatures intertwined in an eternal dance. It was a kind of altara place of remembrance and invitation. Era felt a gentle warmth in her chest, as if the stone was breathing alongside her. She traced the carvings with her fingertips, and a soft melody rose from the water, echoing the lullabies Mera once sang. She hurried back to the village, bringing word of the cove. That evening, the villagers gathered there, lanterns casting warm light on the stone and their faces. Together they sang the songs of the sea and their ancestors, their voices weaving into the water's own music. The cove became a new heart for the village, a sacred space where land met sea and past met present. In the days that followed, more signs appeared, shells that glowed faintly in the dark, footprints that vanished at the water's edge, and dreams filled with shimmering paths beneath the waves. The villagers understood that their story was not just about loss or disappearance, but about transformation and belonging. The sea had called them not to vanish, but to become part of a greater rhythm, a rhythm that sang of quiet journeys, whispered memories, and the endless dance between worlds. And as twilight deepened, the village rested beneath a sky brushed with stars, cradled by the soft, eternal hum of the ocean's lullaby. The village settled into a tender quiet, as if the sea itself had woven a soft blanket over their lives. The days stretched slowly, marked by gentle waves and whispered breezes. With every passing moment, the story of the fisherman who vanished became less a tale of sorrow and more one of transformation, a peaceful merging of land, sea, and spirit. Era, now a keeper of the village's stories, walked often to the hidden cove. There she would sit beneath the carved stone, listening to the ocean's endless song. Sometimes she thought she could hear faint laughter carried on the wind, or see flickers of light dancing beneath the waves, like memories playing in the sunlit depths. The villagers found solace in these quiet moments, their hearts attuned to the soft rhythms of life around them. They knew that the fisherman's journey had not ended in loss, but had shifted into something deeper, a secret harmony that lived beneath the surface, waiting to be felt rather than seen. One evening, as the village gathered by the shore, a gentle mist rose from the sea, wrapping the world in a silvery glow. The air was cool and sweet, filled with the scent of salt and wildflowers. Voices grew softer, songs slower, as if time itself had paused to listen. In that hush, the village felt a presence calm, ancient and comforting. It was the sea's own breath, a lullaby sung in waves and whispers. The villagers closed their eyes, breathing in the moment, carried gently on the ocean's endless hum. In their dreams, they sailed once more through shimmering waters and starlit skies, guided by the quiet history of fishermen who had vanished, only to become part of the sea's eternal story. The night deepened, soft and slow. The village rested, wrapped in a blanket of stars and seasung. And the gentle tale continued, whispered forever by the waves. As the night grows deeper and the gentle lull of the sea fades into the quiet of your own breathing, may you feel the soft embrace of stories carried on timeless tides. Like the fisherman, sometimes we journey quietly into the unknown, not to disappear, but to transform, to become part of something larger, something endless. Let your thoughts drift with the rhythm of waves, each breath a gentle swell, each heartbeat a slow current guiding you toward rest. Close your eyes and let the ocean's lullaby carry you softly into sleep, where stories blend with dreams and peace settles like a calm tide over your soul. Good night. End of script. Good night.